Hey guys, I hope to finish off this GE810 in this video. If you recall in the last segment, I sorted out the high voltage issue, so I've got that buttoned back up. I then went and replaced the horizontal and vertical hold control. It had been suggested that maybe I could swap out the covers of the original control with the new one I got, which was rusty. And I entertained that thought, but when I looked at them more closely, I realized they're not the same. I think they're both original, though, but perhaps GE switched vendors or some point or something like that, so these covers would not work on that pot. So after I removed the rust with some navel jelly, I just brushed on a little rusty metal primer, and hopefully that will keep the rust from coming back. Now, if you recall, after I got the high voltage fixed, had a good sharp picture, but the height wasn't so good anymore, even with the height control maxed out. So now I want to take a look at that. One issue is, one reason why that would be, is that when you have a high voltage, it's accelerating the electrons faster towards the screen. It takes more energy to deflect them. Now the high voltage is in the right range. It's about 9,000 volts where it's supposed to be. So I think there really is something up with the vertical. So let's see. 6V6 output. Common enough. So I have tested the tube, but after my last little fiasco with tubes, might be worth swapping that one out, or at least testing it. So here's where I'm at with the 6V6 vertical output tube I've been using all along. And this is with the height cranked up all the way, which I think might be just good enough to fill the mask. But it's not quite as good as I'd like it to be. I want to have more range. So I pulled out a couple other 6V6s. After my little adventure with the horizontal, I don't want to go nuts with tearing the yoke apart or anything before I just try the simple thing of swapping out a few tubes. Now, the stash of tubes I've been pulling these from, I've used in other sets. I've tested them before, and I know they're not dead, and they're not really weak either. Even though I said I've used this tube before in other sets and it worked okay, we've got less height with this tube, so let's try another one. Got plenty of 6V6s, so let's try it and see how much things change. This in particular is kind of interesting. It's a DeForest Sanabria, I think is how you pronounce that, which is a weird little boutique brand based out of Chicagoland area, I think. Wouldn't mind finding a DeForest Sanabria TV someday, but for now I've got one tube from one. Well, that's more like it. So, just like with the horizontal, the vertical is also very particular about what tube is used in it. Okay, next let's see how this telesave does. Never heard of that one before. I'm guessing it was some low-end brand, maybe like you get at a drugstore or something. Okay, but so far, this telesave tube I think is performing the best. And I've got one more that I've pulled out so far. If I went up into the attic, I could get a bunch more. But so far, telesave is the winner. Alright, let's give this Motorola a try. I want to move on to getting the set aligned and tweaked and getting back in the cabinet so I can actually enjoy this set performing once again. Oh, and if you're wondering why it's like this, it's because the vertical output tube is cold and the rest of the tubes have already warmed up, and that's why we've got a line and the vertical has a bit of a delay. Not as good as a telesave. Fortunately, we're looking at there. It was MeTV, and when they show the programming, it's 4:3. But when they go to commercials, sometimes they go to widescreen, so you get the letterboxing, and it can be tough to tell how good the height is. So actually, this height is, I'd say, just as good or better than the telesave, actually. All right, so leave this tube in there. Why not? Put a Motorola in a GE set. Picture's looking pretty darn good too. I fired up a tube tester and grabbed all those 6v6s because I want to test them to see if what we saw with the vertical height is reflected in how well they test. So first up, this is the GE 6v6 I had in there originally. Very short height, but it tests good. And specifically about 65 on the scale. Alright, so the way I separated these, the 3 on this side, so the GE and these 2 had noticeable diminished height. This guy was okay, that's the DeForest and Abria, and then these 2 were good. That's the Motorola and the telesave. Alright, so this one isn't as good, but it's in the good, about 53. I'm really surprised about that GE, which is well into the good, and I think that was pretty much the worst of all these tubes. At least with the 5v4s, when I tested them a second time, there were some that were noticeably bad, and those are the ones that produced the weakest high voltage. This one's well into the good, about 75, and this also had significant height issues when I tried using it. This one was pretty darn good, but not quite as good as these 2. And yet, doesn't test much better than that last one I just tested, or actually this is a little bit less, about 74. So this is the one that was best of all. That's the one I left in the set. Let's see what we get with this. So it's pretty clear that at least when it comes to this set, I can't rely on this tube tester to figure out which one would work good in the vertical circuit, because so far all of these are in the good, or at least on the edge of good, and should all work fine according to this tester. But clearly they do not. Alright, well at least this one tests the best out of the group. Well, you might be thinking, hey, maybe your tube tester's off. I can double check that. I have a card for calibration, which I do periodically. I'm pretty sure that this thing's working properly. I've got a little bit of leakage on this guy, that's the telesave. And that's surprising, this is one of the weakest of all the tubes. Yet it was almost as good as that Motorola when it came to the vertical deflection. Very strange. Now that I hope all that nonsense is behind us with the horizontal and vertical issues, I'm going to move on to doing the alignment. I'm just going to do the sound for now. The picture seems to be pretty sharp, and this is one of the more complex sets I've encountered as far as doing alignment goes. Like, I do not want to mess with this tuner. It uses rotary wafer switches, and these are the various channel slugs, and I think if you needed to adjust these, I'm going to have to melt the wax off and stretch or squeeze the coils. I'm not going to be messing with that, that's for sure. But even the IF is a little bit ugly. I read through the instructions, and I'd rather not do it if I don't have to. But what I will do is the sound. And this will be purely visual. In the past, I'm used to injecting the audio carrier like 21.25 megahertz and peaking the coils using a VTVM, like this RCA voltometer. But no, for this they said to do it all visually, both in the riders and the SAMs. I want to go with the SAMs because it's a little bit clearer and more concise the way they organize this in these tables, whereas in the riders it's a lot of text, just several pages of text you have to read through in order to go through this. So I need to rig up what they call a dummy antenna, which is a capacitor, in series with the output of my sweep generator and various test points. So we're going to start out with pin 1, the grid of a 6AU6, which is the first audio IF, I think. And this uses a 21.8 megahertz audio IF. And then there's various setup things about adjusting the contrast to get negative 4 volt bias on the UGC bus and so on, and tells you where to hook up the scope. So I'm going to go through and do all this, and hopefully I will have a much better sound. Here's my audio response before I make any changes. The marker there is 21.8, so the peak is definitely off. And here's what we've got for amplitude. So let's see if I can shift this peak over and increase that amplitude. Alright, that's looking better. So that's the IF response. And now we move on to the S curve. Well, that's what I have for the S-curve, and that's not so good. With the marker right here, it's supposed to be symmetrical about that, so should have the same exact hump up to that point as we do down here. So I've got to make some tweaks. Alright, after a bit of tweaking, I got things looking pretty darn good, so I'll disconnect all this junk and fire it up with a regular signal and see what the sound is like now. Or rather, hear what the sound is like now. Although it may sound horrible, this sound is actually better than it was before. Before I really couldn't make out anything intelligible. Now, I'm using the same converter box that I've had plenty of trouble with before because it's really the only convenient source of signal I've got in my workshop right now. So next up, I'm going to take this over to my living room and hook up to my cable setup. Alright, let's give this a shot on my cable setup.
Way for you to feel more mighty is to go do something big and dramatic, something like, I don't know, disabling all the security cameras at City Hall.
Yeah, I could do that.
Wonderful! Now get going! We now return to our regular
Alright, so last thing I want to do is tweak the horizontal vertical linearity and in the home stretch finally.
Again. Bye, Ma. I'll be back later.
While you're out, can you get me a couple things from the store?
Already left, Ma. I can't hear you. Mighty villains do not run errands.
Oh, Chuck! So easily deceived. Go and do my...
I'm turning my attention now to the beat-up cabinet of that second GE810 set. Just got the front off. I think the brass bezel pieces would clean up very nicely. So I'll offer these to the restoration community, see if anybody needs them. And here's that safety glass. It has some bubbling around the edges, but it seems to be better than mine. The one on my other set, the bubbles reach up into the viewing area, whereas here they're just on the very edge. So assuming this glass cleans up nice, I think I'll put this into my set. Still have to undo the nut on the other side to get the logo off, and then maybe if I'm really lucky, I can peel this grill cloth off without any damage and plop it onto my other set. It's a bit dirty, but I'll try brushing this off before I try peeling it off, because I think this is just, you know, surface dust and dirt. A little bit of fraying here and there, but I can use a couple dabs of glue and kind of get that down. See, what happened with my other one, for those of you who didn't watch the series, was it was very loose, and I just peeled it right off, and it was filthy. So I cleaned it, and it cleaned up great, but it shrunk a little bit, and it started to fray a little bit. So I really couldn't put it back down very easily. It shrunk so much that the edge here had moved over to here, and likewise on the other side. So instead of having this about 3/8 of an inch border, it was right up to the edge. So when it came to stretching it or positioning it, I had no extra material to work with, which made it very awkward. But with this, you know, if I'm careful and it peels off, I will just transfer right onto the other cabinet and dab a little glue here and there and stick it right down. Otherwise, it'll be back to searching on eBay or Joann Fabrics for something modern that looks good enough. Here's a little dry run of the transplanted grill cloth. I can see from the old screw holes where it should line up, and it lines up quite well. Like there's where the logo goes. And yeah, it's a little dirty, a little ratty, but it fits fine. The old vent holes and all that line up. You can see how it's kind of stained and dirty. I tried cleaning this a little bit, but unless I use some pretty harsh stuff like bleach or something, I just don't think it's going to really come clean, but that's fine. You know, what I'm going to do is just lightly tack glue in a few key spots, so if I ever want to, I can easily peel this off. Also, a lot of it is held in place just by pressure from like this bezel, so I don't really need to put glue around here or around the edges. You can see how it's depressed here from the frame that goes down around it. So I'm just going to tack it in the corners, a few other key spots, and then secure all this stuff, and that'll be that. I think that's going to work out just fine. There were a few areas where it was unraveling, and I used a toothpick and kind of poked the threads back in and wove them back together, so it's not bad. It's not entirely straight everywhere, but that's why I didn't glue it really down much, just in a couple spots so I can kind of poke things around and slide them around as needed. But even like this, I think it's pretty darn good. Yeah, good enough for me, that's for sure. It's certainly better than the old burlap. Now, one last thing I want to do is, I haven't touched this yet. This is, well, I mean, it's not the original finish, it's my refinishing job from a couple years ago. And when I did it, I did not use any grain filler. And I think I put the toner on a little bit too heavy, so you can see how much darker it is than this. But it's a lack of grain filler that bothers me even more. So this is just really, really rough. So I am going to strip this down. It's easy to work on because it's just a separate piece of wood that just lifts right off. So I can work on this while finishing up the rest of the set and then install that at the end. Now, as for that glass, it actually cleaned up quite well. And there's only a few bubbles right around the edge, so this definitely is much better. However, there's a slight problem right there. There's something that got in between the sheets of glass, and there's a kind of a white spot with a bit of a halo around it. Otherwise, just a few scratches here and there. Whereas the other piece of glass I have, well, I'll pull it out and show you. Here's the other piece, and you can see it's got significant bubbles coming out from the edges that are creeping into the visible area. So, I think for now, I'm going to go with this glass, and I'll hang on to this. And I'm pretty much going to hang on to everything I can possibly salvage from the second GE and post in the video camera classifieds and let people know I've got spare parts in case anybody needs something. I stripped down the front wooden frame and I'm working on filling in the grain right now. It will take me a couple days to finish with the grain filling and applying some new finish. So I'm afraid there will be at least one more video on this set. Hopefully the finale will be uploaded in a few days, so please stay tuned.